Hello, welcome back to my network. We have a special for you today. It's something that we've been trying to organise for months on end, and due to travel restrictions on both Christopher and I's schedule, we've finally been able to find a half-hour slot for us to have a chat. So, Christopher, good to be with you. You're a mining strategist, commodity expert, founder at Hallgarten Company. Good to be with you again.
Yep, great to be with you too.
Look, I think given we're 5 days away from the US election, let's start there. So we'll do an easy one to begin with. Do you think the outcome has much impact either way on commodity prices?
Oh, it could be cataclysmic. Um, but who knows? You know, Trump is very sort of aggressive, but is he aggressive only domestically, but not internationally? Because we are in a very dangerous world at the moment, and there's a bit of a feeling that that Trump's going to, as he has done in the past, sort of like cut loose from international involvements. But does that mean he's going to cut loose and leave the Israelis to their fate with Iran, but also leave the Ukrainians to their fate with Russia? Um, how is that going to play out? And that is very difficult to work out because in this election, he spent most of his time domestically focused, and he hasn't said what he's going to get away from. So we don't know. Um, I'm not going to make any predictions on what the election will be, but everyone's saying it's going to be very close, so it's like a real nail biter. So we have to wait for the night itself. But I do think that that on the Democrats' side, that Kamala Harris is going to be a lot different from Biden. Um, Biden was very much coasting along and has not really grasped any nettles in the Middle East. He's been totally sort of like lost in the nettle patch. Um, so we don't know really what she's going to do either. But she could be quite a dramatic change from what we've had so far. But I don't know. The one thing that is out there, at least on the Trump victory side, is that he's making pro-US automobile industry comments. Um, but does that mean that he's going to be pro-ICE rather than pro-EV? And I suspect that is the angle he's going to take, which then sort of pulls the rug under a lot of the IRA's push to promote a US EV supply chain. And how that's going to play out is also a mystery. Does that mean that there's going to be essentially, removal? Many of these mandates in the US are coming from the state level, not from the national level. So, California will continue doing what it's doing about, various dates in the future that are triggers for, removal of ICEs from the road or whatever. Um, but we don't know. I'm not sure that it can be top down. But Trump also is sort of light on economic policy. Um, for some sort of libertarian, sort of right wing character, he hasn't said too much about reducing deficits and cutting spending and all that type of stuff. And he's more on the supply side with sort of like tax cuts and things like that. So it's not sure whether he's going to, because the IRA has been a very expensive item for the US government budget. Is he going to be pulling back from some of the boondoggles that are included within that legislation? So we shall see, but it's a mystery at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, lots to unpack. I mean, Trump has obviously come out and said that EVs he doesn't believe is the way forward from the US. He believes it's a bit of a scam. It's not ready yet. He thinks it's a bit of a ploy by China to and whatnot. This is the sort of rhetoric that he's given there. So I think you're probably right in terms of that push, especially from the very top, doesn't really seem to be there anymore.
Yeah.
Um, that would suggest to me that maybe a second leg or a bit more life in the palladium platinum sector that's obviously struggling massively right now.
Yeah. And then another leg downwards in the lithium space if that comes to pass as well. So it's sort of like Trump is sort of go long PGMs, go extra short lithium, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think one of the things that we initially spoke about when we spoke about actually putting this together was almost like a commodity roulette, where I'm going to ask you a few questions on many different commodities. We'll try and fire through them and sort of get where you are. And it feels a bit like roulette at the moment with where the prices are for most of these things, aside from precious metals. So, look, why don't we start with something positive? Gold and silver obviously doing quite well at the moment, especially gold. Silver still potentially has a bit of catching up to do.
Yeah. Okay. So, the gold and silver price are product of the international, slide into war. Um, if Trump gets elected and then lets everything sort of like go internationally and sort of, but I'm not. The gold and silver price are not related to monetary factors at the moment. They're not related to inflation or money printing or any of that type of stuff. They're directly related to international tensions and people's concerns about those. Um,
What makes you say that? Because most commentators would argue that it's directly related to interest rates, inflation, quantitative easing, the devaluing of the dollar, people not.
yeah, but the traditional argument of these people is also that higher interest rates are bad for gold because people then, can go and put their money in the bank. But we've seen higher interest rates and we've seen higher gold. So that argument's been blown out of the water. Gold bugs will grab at any fig leaf that they can to cover their exposures. Um, but that argument just doesn't work, and the inflation is supposedly down, but the interest, so we've got real interest rates now, because you are seeing interest rates of 5 and 6% around, and inflation is supposedly 2%. So that's a bit of a turnaround. For many years we had sort of interest rates well below the inflation rate, because the public always perceived that inflation was higher than the official numbers. Um, and I still perceive that inflation's higher than the real numbers. And inflation is definitely not back in its cage. It's still roaming loose, and there's a lot of catch up. A lot of people out there are feeling like their standard of living has been crimped by higher prices, and their salaries and remuneration have not gone up at the same pace as they have as have their costs. So those people, immediately that they feel like they've got a bit of traction, are pushing for higher wages, which ultimately feeds back into the inflation. So inflation is with us, and I'm not seeing it going away. And that then means, particularly, that there's not as much scope as many people think for interest rate cuts. Because as soon as they cut interest rates and then inflation rebounds again, they're going to say you cut too soon. And so the central banks are, walking a tightrope here, because much as they love to cut interest rates and prop up the housing market, because of course we all worship the golden calf of property, there's no real reason to cut interest rates too fast, except to bail out the housing sector, or keep the housing sector, going up, which is part of the problem. It's very much a part of the inflation problem.
Okay. On the silver side of things, obviously people were seeing it a lot more now as an industrial metal, with 25% now being used as solar energy, or solar panels. It's now less seen as a monetary metal. Do you think the impact on, if wars did cease, do you think that would have much impact on the silver price, or are there some stronger fundamentals behind that metal?
I think it would damage the gold price more than it would the silver price. The silver price has really been playing catch up, but it's been playing catch up poorly. It has not been able to catch up with the gold move, and the gold silver ratio is not as good as it was, even a couple of years ago. It's deteriorated quite severely. Um, Silver is a good safe haven as well. 25% for solar panels. is all well and good, but there are other silver usages. But I still see silver as the poor man's gold, and people are buying it. I mean, it was only $24 in recent memory, and now it's 32. That's a pretty interesting move upwards. And while gold's gone up, silver, I mean, they don't have to move in concert, but they're obviously moving in the same direction, just at different speeds. Um, and if the man in the street gets more concerned about having his money somewhere else, but not in the banks, and we haven't really, except for a little flurry of bank crashes in the US with a year ago, we haven't seen banks being severely called into question. I think that's when people really start to think about their safe haven qualities of precious metals, is when their savings are actually at risk rather than just issues like inflation.
But isn't essentially their savings are at risk because of the levels of inflation? I mean, like you say, that okay, you might see a stat that says inflation's at 2%. I think anyone who goes to the supermarket or goes to the petrol pub would not agree with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're seeing other groups like Goldman Sachs and even Citigroup even today have just released their price forecast on gold to reach 3,000 in the short term. Surely there needs to be a bit more surrounding this, other than just prospect of increased tensions in the Middle East or in Europe. That there must be, surely, what the main argument really is that the value of the dollar is decreasing. People don't feel certain that essentially the money that the fiat currencies are already working, and year on year, if you look at the value of what a dollar could buy you 10 years ago compared to today, it shrunk massively. And whereas gold seems to hold its value, and is that not really more of a driving factor?
Um, well, it's up to the individual whether they're more concerned about their savings, because a lot of people don't have any savings anymore because the savings got eroded. Um, and money has become almost like monopoly money. I mean, I was at an event last year, and someone from an Australian mining company referred to the Australian peso, and the Australian dollar is like a peso. The Canadian currency is more like a bolivar, where we're sort of the currencies are one by one, becoming sort of like small change. Um, and particularly in a demonetized economy where everything is done electronically. I saw a busker in London having the recommended donation as £3, and I thought, with a card. Whoa! I mean, people used to throw their 20p's and their 10p's and their 50p's there. The guy wants £3. Because he's got transaction charges to deal with. So I think, whoa, this is even the buskers are pricing themselves out.
Yeah.
But coming back to your point though, if the missiles really start flying, and we've only seen sort of like not even in the Middle East, if they really start flying, 3,000 is going to be a distant memory. It's going to be a lot higher than that. Because there's going to be spillover, and there's enormous amounts of money. It doesn't matter what a householder in Liverpool is going to do with their savings. It's more what are wealthy people and middle class in the Middle East going to do if they think that they may have to move out of their home. And I'm not talking about ones in the two conflicting states at the moment, because it's now spilled over into Lebanon. If you lived in Beirut, are you going to be wanting to have having a portable currency, whether it's gold or dollars or whatever they are? The answer is yes, because you don't know if your building's going to get hit. And so there's a lot of money there that alone could move the gold price to $4,000. And people say, "Whoa, he's had a conversion," because I've never been a gold bug, but that type of tension. I mean, you just ask yourself the question: if you were in Warsaw in 1939, would you prefer to have a bank book with some money in it, or would you prefer to have a small number of gold or silver ingots? And definitely, I'd rather have gold and silver ingots in that scenario. And that's what you have to think if you're living in Beirut or Baghdad or or Tehran. You want or Cairo. I mean, because spillover from this thing could be, beyond our perceptions of what it might be. We don't know. But definitely safe haven qualities of gold and silver. Yeah, please. You do need to have them.
And what in your obviously I completely understand that argument and agree with it, but why that doesn't quite explain why the central banks are buying gold as fast as they can as such, does it?
It's really the non-Western central banks that are doing that. Um, some of these banks don't particularly trust the US. The US is, US extraterritoriality in legislation and actions of the SEC and the Fed and other people. The long arm of the US in financial matters is not liked by people. We've seen various economies around the world that have gone into default or whatever. And, sovereigns have defaulted since the dawn of time. But the US, sort of set itself up as some sort of policeman where courts in New York can decide whether countries that borrowed money from someone in another country can then be forced to pay it back. And I'm specifically referring to my beloved Argentina. Where US courts, intervene in things. And I think a lot of countries don't particularly like the idea that either their dollar reserves or their gold reserves are potentially up for alienation by a government that, they're not necessarily got anything to do with. Venezuela's run into these problems.
Yeah, I think as soon as Russia got taken out of SWIFT as well, I think people started to realise that they need a different hedge, right? Well, moving on from precious metals because I think we could talk about that all day. Something that not been o- something I've not been overly impressed with, or hasn't really lived up to expectations, is copper. Every year, I'd say probably for the last 8 9 years, all I keep hearing is there's a copper deficit, there's a supply crunch. This year's the year it's going to happen, and I'm still yet to behold this huge deficit in copper. What's going on?
Um, what's going on? Well, the problem in copper is that there is a inflection point, but it isn't yet. And too many people have called the inflection too early. And I think that the inflection is there. Many people are focusing on the demand side. I'd focus more on the supply side because the world is very dependent upon a few large, very old mines in Chile and elsewhere that nothing is forever, and certainly Chuquicamata and Escondida and things like that are not forever either. The point at which they, sputter out their flame is not clear. And too many people who don't know anything about it are being prepared to say, well, it's now, when it would have been more cautious to say it's soon or it's within the next 5 years. But apocalypse now in the copper space, I don't feel. And also, people are hitching too many wagons to the horse of the EV, to mix a metaphor there, because a lot of the copper story is tied up with this energy transition thing. And it's not taking into account the fact that there is already in many, many economies a very large amount of infrastructure already. We're not talking about what is the infrastructure in Nigeria for EV charging stations. We're talking about what is it in Norway. And does Norway need a lot of copper to convert from ICEs to electric charging stations? And the answer is no. And if you go to Nigeria, you'll be very hard pressed to find an EV. Now in Argentina, there's something like 46 million people, and there are like 14 million vehicles, and you cannot find an EV there. And most of Latin America has no EVs or virtually none. The same in Africa. There's a bit more take up in Asia, but penetration of EVs is very low, and it could be reversed. I mean, if we come back to your initial point about Trump, if there's no pressure whatsoever for a conversion to EVs in the US, it pretty much won't happen because the EVs are way more expensive. And ultimately, the inconveniences, range anxiety and charging points, where are they, and all that type of stuff, a bit of a deal killer for many of the customers. And we're seeing in London, of course, that people are being forced out of ownership of ICEs, but they can't afford the EVs. So now there's a whole lot of people who've basically been told that they can get on their bike or walk rather than have, some clapped out old car that they used to have. And that is going down very badly. And so I really think that a few of these to the moon charts of EV demand and EV consumption have done everyone a big disservice, and probably more of a disservice to the copper space than to even the lithium space, because they've really been smoking something in their views on where copper had to go, and it hasn't gone there, which has left a few people hanging out to dry. The copper price is great. It's an excellent copper price, and it's promoting a lot of mid-sized projects. And we need those projects, not for the EV space. We need them to replace the mines that are, in sunset mode all around the world, but most particularly in places like Chile.
Yeah. Well, look, we go to a lot of these junior mining conferences. I sit down and I interview a lot of these junior mining CEOs. It surprises me how many copper porphyry projects there are that are up for grabs with a resource already on that haven't been built. I mean, look, without doing a thorough analysis, but it would shock me if, even if we do say one of these larger mines does close down, that there does seem to be quite a lot in the pipeline that if the incentive price was there, we could probably build within 3 to 5 years.
Absolutely, and they are being built. I mean, particularly in Argentina again, there are in San Juan province like 5 of big second-tier mines. Now, we're not really looking anymore in this world for Chuquicamatas and Escondidas, because they sort of, there may be some of them somewhere, but no one knows where they are at the moment. But there are some big second-tier copper projects that are really big, billions of pounds. And they're just sitting there, they're going through the development motions, and $4 copper definitely makes them very viable. And so, but they're not now. They're in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, because some of them are take a long time to build. But they're in the pipeline. Anyone who says there's no copper supply pipeline is lying. The copper supply pipeline is out there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Look, shifting from copper, something else that probably be a bit more depressing. In fact, probably the most depressing metal at the moment. Let's talk about nickel.
Right.
Massive oversupply from Indonesia in the last 2 years.
Yep,
We did see a little bit of some issues with some permits being granted and changing the law in Indonesia last year, which sort of had a bit of a lag effect. They started importing ore from the Philippines, but really, I mean, other than a short spike during LME week a few weeks ago, the nickel price has once again crashed, and we're below $16,000. I mean, how much do you look at that market? How much insight do you have into what's happening there?
I think, well, once again, this is even I don't know if it's worse or the same as the copper space, but I went to an event like a year and a half ago, and one of the predictions was that EVs would be using, by 2050 or something, 15% of the global nickel supply. Well, what's the other 85%? Well, stainless steel. But that was a projection decades out. EVs aren't the tail that wags the nickel dog. Nickel's a dog all of its own. And as we've seen, there's no shortage of nickel around because the poor prices have only resulted in nickel projects getting frozen, and other projects, well, other mines going on care and maintenance. Particularly the Australian nickel industry is like disappeared beneath the waves, and nickel in other places is very uncompetitive with the mass projects that there are in Indonesia and the Philippines. Um, so it's not, the nickel space and the developers in the nickel space have done themselves no favors by the allowing, and I blame the companies themselves, the massive blowouts that we saw on some of the builds, whether it was Goro or Ambatovi, these builds in the West that cost so much money, there's so much more money than they'd originally been budgeted, has just meant that investors have no appetite for new projects in the West. Indonesia can do it because it's got the Chinese sort of lurking around. They've actually got the Chinese a bit over a barrel there. But the Chinese have played ball in moving smelters in country, which is very much against Chinese sort of practice. But the symbiotic relationship between Indonesia and China has developed on nickel, which is sort of like a party of two. Everybody else is outside, sort of starving to death in this scenario. And China gets cheaper nickel. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I want to ask you about a few other metals, and I'm sort of worried and sorry to the audience for this going down a depressing road. But why don't we talk about rare earths?
All right.
Monazite prices down, NdPr prices seem to be,
Yeah.
well, they're a fraction of what they were even a couple of years ago. Again, a lot of this revolves around EVs and battery magnets and
Yeah.
whatnot. I guess the same story as before. The demand hasn't caught up to where people thought it would be.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. People were just way too bullish. So, and I would associate it once again to some of these lithium charts, which everyone just thought there's a direct relationship with their rare earth. So a rare earth chart has to mirror that, and our nickel chart has to mirror that, and our copper chart has to mirror that, and our manganese and whatever. And it just has not come to pass. And rare earths, the Chinese still in the box seat there, except in heavy rare earths, and they have decided to keep control of the magnet industry by effectively, choking off the West. But the West, because of sort of distorted things like the IRA, and because of governments like Australia and Canada dishing out subsidies to rare earth refinery builds, the problem is not going to be going away. And what has happened, particularly for there's not a vast number of rare earth companies in the same way that there was back in 2011, but there's still, I don't know, 60, whatever. But there used to be 20 during the dark days, and many of these are still surplus to requirements because, frankly, monazite sands, no matter how cheap they may get, are actually, a category killer that is destroying the prospects of boring old carbonatites and bastnasites and eudialytes and all these exotic mineralizations. Basically, who needs them? There's even a feeling that the Chinese may be buying in rare earths from around the world because Bayanobo, which of course is the monster mine in the rare earth space, is past its prime. And we've got to remember the rare earths at Bayanobo are only a byproduct of iron ore production. They're not the main game. And Bayanobo has been big and it's been enormous for many decades, but it's definitely past. It's seen its better days. Um,
Is that true? Last report I heard was it still has around 300 to 400 years worth of reserves left on it.
yeah, but it's economic. Have the Chinese actually undermined their own economics?
Well, I think they have anyway because they're putting production quotas on rare earths, aren't they, in production? So even if it's not profitable, they're still the states have a quota of how much, or the refiners have a quota of how much they need to produce. So it's quite tough. For I guess that cost then just gets passed downstream, right? To then otherwise, how are they affording to do it?
Making losses. If you're an SOE, just like in the West, when the West had lots of government run enterprises, whether with British Steel or British Shipbuilding or whatever, um, the governments were concerned about the fact that they were losing money, but they still shoveled money in their direction. So SOEs have really not commercial instincts as their prime driver. And I think that's why some of the Western governments are not only focusing on SOEs as being potentially sort of like military fronts for things, they're also looking at them as being, sort of basically uncommercial competitors in a lot of spaces. And I'm not just talking mining; I'm talking manufacturing and further downstream that are spoilers because they're not worried about their bottom lines. They're worried about meeting their quotas under 5-year plans, which is a totally different equation altogether.
Yeah, and I asked this question before actually to a rare earth expert, and it's all well and good the West subsidising and paying for the capex of our own refineries and our own mines, but I'm assuming they're not going to be continuously subsidising the actual production of these things. So
If they're not, then these things will shut down. One thing is subsidizing the building of it, but then, governments hate white elephants. I mean, white elephants can take you down in an election. So if you spend 1.5 billion subsidizing a rare earth refinery, and then it starts operations and 2 months in, it shuts down because it's not profitable, that comes back and bites the politicians where they don't like to be bitten.
yeah, okay. Why don't we move on to something a bit more cheery, and something that there is a bit of a cult following for, and that's the tin market.
Yeah,
I know
no.
you obviously went to
Part of the
Alphamin recently.
cult.
You're part of the cult, good. Look, for me, this is probably one of the most interesting metals at the moment in terms of the macro outlook. There does seem to be genuinely a shortage of
Yeah,
real projects coming through the pipeline within this commodity,
yeah,
and demand is increasing year on year. So, why don't we talk a little bit about that and how that's shaping up? Because I think even the price now is over 30,000.
yeah, yeah. No, the price was recently as high as 35, and it's pulled back to 31 at the moment. Um, the situation is, but in fact, there was a decline in tin demand last year. But the problem is that the decline in production was bigger than the decline in demand. And the decline in production is linked to two things. One is Indonesia is past its prime. Indonesia relies upon alluvials, and it used to extract these alluvials out of rivers and near shore. But that's all been exploited, so now it's having to go offshore with big dredges, and the grade of those deposits is plunged, and the cost of extracting the material from a river that's 2 meters deep versus offshore where the product is 50 meters down or 100 meters down is a lot different. And so the economics for Indonesia are deteriorating by the day. The grades are deteriorating. The production is deteriorating. And that is the big problem because Indonesia was a monster. It was really big. And the projects, except for the project in the DRC, or the mine in the DRC, which I visited recently, there are the projects that are coming down the pipeline are really small in the tin space. They are tailings, reworkings. There's frenzy of drilling going on in Tasmania, which Tasmania used to be a major tin location. Um, what still is an important tin location, but people are trying to find new stuff, and they're finding it, but they're not actually building the mines. So there's no solution in sight for the tin shortage, and then you've also got the situation in Burma, which is very interesting. Burma, Myanmar, whatever you want to call it, where
Yeah,
the last
what is the current situation in the last
well, the
state?
last state is just basically said no tin for you, for the Chinese, and but it's no tin for anyone because these sort of rebel-ish provinces that sort of are in the north of Burma and along the Chinese border, they if they're not selling to China, they're not selling to anyone because the product is going out through the ports to Western markets. Burmese batit is staying in the ground as far as anyone else can work out at the moment, um, and the tensions between China and Burma are rising, and that has been a happy hunting ground for the Chinese in tin, in antimony, in rare earths, and in things exotica like jade, where the Chinese have really just come in and sort of ripped off what they wanted and taken it across the border. Many cases using Chinese workers. So in fact, there's almost no trickle down in the Burmese economy. Burmese economy is losing royalties, it's losing exports, it's not making jobs, it's losing its commodities, and it's getting absolutely nothing out of it.
Yeah. Okay. Look, just to wrap things up as well, Christopher. Like the, I remember a long time. It might have been 2017. I think you might have called vanadium being the best performing commodity back then. Uh, I remember also in more recent times you've been a big ball on antimony, and that seems to have come true.
Yes.
So a few
And
obscure and tin. Oh, look, and this is why I love talking to you because you actually you don't just cover the commodities that we've just spoken about there, the base metals and the precious metals that everyone else has an opinion on. You do get down and dirty into the less well known.
yeah.
What for 2025? What's your obscure metal of choice? What should people be looking out for? What do you think is going to be the top performer?
Um, well, the ones that go down least, maybe. Um, uh, I'm not. I'm not seeing great uplift in antimony or tin. Vanadium, unfortunately, is not not looking good. Though someday it will have its day in the sun. Um, but of obscure metals, I cannot really think of any. Uh, 2025 is going to be a very interesting year. Maybe tungsten, but tungsten is going to be driven. Tungsten will go crazy if the military situation escalates anywhere, uh, because tungsten is the military metal. Um, so it really depends what happens on that front because economically the world is merely puttering along at the moment. Most of the growth economies that people were looking for, great things from, are really performing pretty sort of slackly, and particularly China itself. And the West is just, sort of in ex-growth mode. There's not a great sort of demand-driven economic picture out there, I don't think. And even if Kamala Harris gets elected, I'm not seeing it as being a great push for anything in the sort of the energy transition space because I think that the Biden government has done, and Biden administration has done about as much as it can from the top to encourage that transition. I don't think a government can do any more and can afford to do any more. Um, at some point, EVs will have to pay for themselves, not the government. Um, so that creates a whole lot of scenarios where, you know, um, not much going on.
Okay, so increased conflicts. You're back in tungsten. If say Trump comes in, wars seem to settle down. We have a relatively peaceful planet. What would be your number one pick? It sounds like it's a tough pick, but what would you go for?
It's a very tough pick. I love zinc. We haven't even mentioned zinc, but zinc has had a move a bit like copper's moved this year, and no one talks about it. Um, so I do like zinc, and I think I still like copper. Maybe copper's year will be now, but I'm not sure. Do metals have to have a year? Can they have a decade instead? That would be a lot better, where things go up like that rather than up like that. Because as we know, when they go up like that, as vanadium can show you, they go down like that.
Yeah,
Um,
and lithium and rare earths and everything else as well.
yeah,
Then,
exactly. What goes up must come down, and particularly the faster it goes up, the faster it comes down.
yeah. No, Christopher, appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.